Case managers have a very unique position because they are the gatekeeper of the case. Oftentimes, they are the point of contact to all the parties. With that comes great responsibility to be transparent in your communication with your parties. So you build that rapport and that trust with the parents. It's going to maintain that partnership with your families, which is really the best way to be successful, is to partner with our parents.
Welcome to this season of the Institute's Child Welfare Podcast. This season, we're exploring the complex and deeply human work that happens at the intersection of child welfare and domestic violence serving systems. In cases involving intimate partner violence, professionals across these systems each bring unique roles, responsibilities, and lived experiences to the table. Those differences can create tension, but they can also spark new understanding, deeper empathy, and more coordinated responses for families. Today, we're joined by Sarah Tedder, a case manager with Four Sisters Solutions. Sarah works directly with families to ensure that they have the support and resources that they need to move forward. Thank you so much for being here, Sarah.
It's my pleasure, Lisa. Thank you for having me.
So, can you start by telling us about your role and how child welfare intersects with domestic violence?
Of course. So I currently serve, as you said, I work with Four Sisters, which is an agency that serves communities in the northern parts of Florida. I am a reunification specialist, so I work hand in hand with parents whose children have been removed and are temporarily under the custody of DCF. We provide parents with trust-based relational intervention in order to maintain and build rapport while developing a relationship conducive of support and mentorship. Making reference to my current caseload and how that intersects with domestic violence, unfortunately, I would have to say that probably each case that I'm working with has had some history of domestic violence. It may not be the primary reason for removal of their children, but there has been a history either with the current other parent or just historically in the family. I began working in child welfare about 15 years ago. I was working for the child protection team in Manatee County, and that's when I first experienced the intersection between domestic violence and child welfare or investigations. I was tasked with assisting in forensic interviews, and some of those interviews did include families where the primary concern was household violence threatening the children. When it got to the point of having a forensic interview, these cases were pretty serious. There was, repeat violence with repeat investigations where at this point law enforcement was getting involved to see where the concerns lie, how protective the other non-offending parent was being. And part of that was interviewing the non-offending parent prior to meeting with their children. And in doing this, I realized that there was a lot of confusion for this other parent. They were dealing with a lot of stressors at the time, going through complying with what investigations was asking them to do, which at that point, 15, 16 years ago, was often to leave. So they were being asked to go into a shelter, to go live with relatives, something of that nature. So there was a lot of stress put onto the victim, the survivor of the domestic violence, in order to provide safety for the children. At that point, I went into case management, so traditional case management with dependency cases, working in the court system. And I was moonlighting at the time for State Place and Rape Crisis Center in Sarasota, working in their shelter with the survivors and their children in domestic violence situations. Around that time frame, Florida started to pilot their co-located advocate program. Sarasota was one of the chosen communities, so I was asked to fill that role. So I did that for quite some time. I worked co-located within the DCF investigations office, as well as working in the advocacy office for the domestic violence, sexual violence programs. It was a great program. It filled a huge gap that was present at the time between what child welfare was aiming to do, which was to protect the children, which is also what the survivor was also aiming to do. But because there was a liaison, it kind of closed the gap, which usually surrounded the confidentiality that survivors of domestic violence are protected under. So I could see that there was a lot of tension between these two groups that were trying to equally help this family because the advocacy or the shelter staff could not confirm or deny that the parents were in the shelter, even though law enforcement or DCF had dropped those children off there. That is kind of how I began in child welfare and working alongside the survivors of domestic violence and their children. And then throughout my career, I have filled many hats. I've worked in leadership, supporting entire agency of case management. So, and throughout all that time, there's always been numerous cases that involve domestic violence, well, perhaps primarily or secondarily for sure.
I really appreciate your very comprehensive background around this. It seems like you've been able to engage with survivors and the issue generally from a lot of different angles. Because you have sort of this unique perspective, what are some of the common challenges that you see among families that are experiencing both domestic violence and child welfare involvement?
Well, the short answer to that would probably be that the primary concern that I see is that child welfare as a whole, as much as they have tried and gotten better, I don't know that they specifically understand that the dynamic, the power and control dynamic that exists within homes where domestic violence is a concern. I think that they immediately go to asking the survivor to leave with the children. That's still very commonplace, to create a safety plan where there's a distance created. This is not always safe for the survivor or their children. Periods of leaving can be very dangerous for survivors, which they understand because this is the life that they live. But someone who does not experience domestic violence on a regular basis, they may not understand that for themselves. So I think that the cookie cutter, one of the barriers I see is the cookie cutter safety planning that is often relied upon by case management if they have not been properly trained on domestic violence and how to safety plan with survivors. Some other barriers I think are barrier for families is financial. So in leaving, it often displaces the mother and her children. I say mother because in most instances it is the female that's being abused and being asked to leave with the children. The abuser may be the primary breadwinner in the home. The lease may be under their name. So there's a lot of things that go into consideration. Their children may be enrolled in school in the location where they live. So moving to a shelter across town is not feasible because they do not have a car. Mom may not be working because her abuser doesn't allow her to have financial freedom. So all of those things are filing through mom's mind when DCF is asking this question that they feel it just seems so simple. Why just leave? Where else can you go with these kids? Another barrier is I think that it's difficult to hold batterers accountable. Services are limited. We rely heavily on anger management as opposed to BIP because BIP, unless court ordered, often comes with a cost that person cannot incur at the time. So there needs to be a great shift in the accountability from what can the survivor do to protect the children to what can the abuser to do to stop harming and creating violence within the home. So that is something that I see as a huge barrier is that they feel there's a similar outcome, but the way to get there seems vastly different.
I appreciate all of those points, and it really drives home what several of our other podcast guests have shared this season around the economic impacts of decision making when it comes to being able to even consider leaving an abusive situation. Certainly, the idea that survivor parents, as you said, often mom, is held to a high standard of needing to take action versus the person who's using harm. I'm also really interested in talking a little bit more about this idea of child welfare workers perhaps not understanding the full scope of the issue. There's a concept called institutional empathy that is in existence in scholarly papers around the idea that domestic violence advocates don't always understand the full history of the child protective system and why they do things the way they do them and the policies that govern them. And then simultaneously, you have child welfare workers who don't understand the movements that have given way to the power and control wheel and the structure that we have now to support survivors, right? For believing in survivors and giving them autonomy and empowerment. You're in this really interesting intersection because you sit at both, right? You've had experience in both, so you really do have this comprehensive view. And in the past, other folks that I've talked to about this subject, it's the ones that have had experience in multiple roles that seem to have just understandably, the best holistic view of of everything that's going on and really seeing things from all angles. So at the Institute, we're really focused on how are we supporting the child welfare workforce. And we know that our advocate partners are huge in this work, and along with law enforcement and a number of other roles. When it comes to the child welfare workforce specifically, what do you think is most helpful, or do you have a suggestion for what is most helpful for educating these very busy professionals, but on a really important topic that, like you said, shows up whether it's the primary reason for a child welfare case to be open or not? It's there in a lot of these families and happening. So what would you recommend that child welfare workers do to better educate themselves on domestic violence and working with those families and survivors?
Well, Lisa, I think that it starts with utilizing your co-located advocate, understanding that they have a unique and specialized perspective, and they're trained to assist in these situations. From what I've seen, these professionals are often underutilized. So, and they may be brought into broad areas where they contribute in generalities. If there's not an ROI, a release of information signed, and all those things that has to be in place for there to be an open communication, I completely understand that they can't speak any further about certain things. However, but really trying to partner, if they're trying to partner with the survivor and build that rapport, that trust, it's in their best interest to open that line of communication. I think that would do great things for the child welfare workforce, because with respect to the survivor, it does become a challenge to provide those services if they're not always attainable. They're not always accessible to the child welfare worker, because it's often misconstrued as they are hiding, they are trying to avoid things of that nature. I think that also utilizing, when the co-located personnel are in your office, utilize them. Staff independently on a case, ones that are troubling, ones that that there's a history of a domestic violence. And also taking the time to take the trainings to understand the power and control, because oftentimes if you know better, you do better. So because I have a background in domestic violence, and I'm working with a mom who's experienced violence with someone else involved in the case, and they're coming to me saying, "I don't feel comfortable that dad's on this staffing. I don't feel comfortable that he's in this hearing. We have an injunction." I know that she has rights. I know that she has rights to have her case separate. She has a case plan that he's not privy to seeing, things of that nature. And I've had to advocate, but that's because I've been educated in those rights. So I think that's something else that would be beneficial to the workforce if they had those opportunities, not just cookie cutter DV trainings that are mandatory to everybody, but really, like, how do we uphold statute when we are dealing with survivors? How do we support FCADV and the work that they do with the Department of Children and Families? Because there's a long history of work that they've done. There's a lot of effort being put forth there, but if that information is not filtered down to the people that are boots to the ground out there with the families, there's not much. It's not going to do much good. So having that experience, being exposed to those more deep and more meaningful trainings, I think would be so beneficial.
I love that two-pronged approach of really taking it upon themselves to learn more, to get more deeply entrenched into trainings that, to your point, go beyond DV 101, right? And get into the nitty-gritty of what that looks like to provide these services in a very complicated arena, but also to recognize that that is really only one area of child welfare that our workers need to be well versed in, right? And that there are these advocates, these co-located advocates who do have that expertise. So yes, education and also collaboration, right? Collaborating with those advocates, those experts that are in the room with you.
And in addition, I wanted to add that we've talked a lot about survivors, but I haven't talked too much about batterers and the services that are available to the offending parent in these cases. And just like any other allegation of child maltreatment, you do not have to have an admission of guilt to work with that parent. You do not have to say, "Dad, have dad say he laid any kind of hands on his partner or the children of his parent of his children. You don't need that because we don't need parents to say, yes, I'm using substances. Yes, I have untreated mental health. We work with them regardless of their perception of what's going on. Same goes for people that are perpetrating violence. We cannot avoid those individuals because they are difficult to work with, because they say that they haven't done anything to mom in most instances. We can just lay it out and say, I always say to my parents, it's okay. Regardless of what you feel, you're entitled to all those feelings. You're entitled to however you think all of this plays out and how you think all of this happened. But however, this is the plan we've come up with, and this is the things that need to happen in order for the children to be considered safe. So it's the same, so I think that those having somebody that is skilled in batterers intervention, that understands and has worked with perpetrators of violence, having those individuals provide training on how to be more comfortable when you're working with a person who has alleged to have perpetrated violence. I think that would make a world of difference for the workforce, because I often find dads in general, but specifically dads who have perpetrated violence, are avoided like the plague. And that doesn't do any good for the families, because that's truly who needs the services.
And where do you get the sense that that comes from? Is it lack of services? Is it fear on the part of the worker? Where do you see that avoidance coming from?
Well, in my experience, what I have seen is that oftentimes many of those individuals, they come off as abrasive, difficult to work with, very blaming the other parent, shifting the accountability and the responsibility elsewhere. What I have found successful in working with people who have perpetrated violence is that I really try to allow them to be as participatory in the process of building their case plan, building their safety plan as they possibly can be. Because if they are used to power and control, that's what they're looking for in that relationship and that dynamic as well. So I do think fear plays a part in it, specifically with, females that I've led that work in child welfare, feeling uncomfortable working with the males, maybe sometimes having them partner with a male case manager so they could feel more safe if that's a concern. And, as leadership, taking those concerns seriously. Some of these people are very dangerous. They have taken their kids, and that's the way that they see it. So, there's definitely a fear factor to it. But I think also it's just, besides slapping a BIP in their lap, not really knowing what else to do with this individual, when really probably there's reasons why they've gotten to be the way that they are, right? And so allowing that part, their trauma, their history of, maybe adverse childhood experiences, to also come to light so they can do some healing on their own, not just address their battering.
Absolutely. Really looking, like you said, for that comprehensive healing for everybody involved. So I want to shift gears a little bit, and it's something that I'm curious about with all different roles on these types of cases, because I know that this word can mean different things to different people. But how would you define a successful outcome on cases like this?
When I look at cases that involve domestic violence or a history of domestic violence, I would define success as one where ultimately the children are safe. They are not being exposed to the violence in their home that they once were. In addition to that, that the survivor feels empowered and feels heard in creating a safety plan that works for her and her family. So you cannot create a safety plan for a family violence threatens child case without the survivor's input. And that's where that co-located advocate becomes imperative, because they are not going to allow for that safety plan to be created without the input of the survivor, because they know above all else that person is the one person that knows how to keep the kids safe. And it's important to remember, she may in her mind think that she's kept her kids safe. She may not understand that the violence affected her children in a negative way. She may just think she was taking the brunt of it all. So I think that success is twofold. It's safe kids and it's empowered survivors.
And I imagine that takes a lot of collaboration, like you said, between child welfare, co-located advocates, BIP providers, I imagine law enforcement in some cases. And so, who are your primary partners and what makes those partnerships effective?
From a general sense, I think if you're looking at child welfare as a whole, I would say our primary partners are lead agency personnel. So your CBCs, your guardian ad litem, the judiciary. So that's usually the attorneys that are attached to the case. Oftentimes, from the onset, it's your investigation team. So knowing your investigators, partnering with your investigators, coming up with developing a way that we stack cases over proactively instead of reactively so that case management is getting a feel of what's going on before they gotten too late or the parents have gone off the grid because they're upset with the outcome of the removal. So those are our who we work with primarily. Of course, we do work with our local law enforcement when necessary, the domestic violence, sexual violence agencies, and all of our providers. So your mental health providers, your substance abuse providers, your psychiatric providers, all these people play a profound role in ensuring that these cases move forward in a positive direction, that all the parties involved are getting the services that they need, and that, the children are being kept safe.
And how do you feel your unique perspectives from the case management world influences those collaborations?
I think case managers have a very unique position because they are the gatekeeper of the case. So oftentimes they are the point of contact to all the parties. They have communication with the caregivers and the kids. They have communication with the parents. They have communication with the guardian ad litem, children's legal services, and the providers to the parents and the children. So with that comes great responsibility, to be transparent in your communication with your parties. So you build that rapport and that trust with the parents. The last thing that you want as a case manager is for the parents to find something out and feel undermined. It's going to undo all the hard work that you've done. So you have to take your position as that gatekeeper very seriously and understand that being transparent is going to keep that trust going. It's going to maintain that relationship. It's going to maintain that partnership with your families, which is really the best way to be successful is to partner with our parents. So I think that it's case management is probably the most difficult and the most unique role in the dependency and child welfare realm, just because our contact is so vast and our dealings are so complex. There's really no part of the case that we don't touch. It's unique. It's definitely unique. While I think most parties deal with their specific part, whether it's the guardian dealing with the welfare of the child, the attorneys dealing with the legality of the parents, the judiciary, our case management world, we deal with all the parts, the visitation part, the relationships with extended family, like all these things, they're very important, so it can be overwhelming, but it's such an important job. I really thank all the people that I work for and I've led through these years because they really have gone out and gone above and beyond for the families that they've worked for, to try to assist in getting to the best outcome, whether that's a reunification or in best case scenarios, avoiding a removal altogether in a non-judiciary case. Yes, it's definitely unique.
And it sounds like a lot of responsibility, right? It sounds like the central hub of the wheel, and there's all these spokes coming out, and it's certainly not a passive role, right? It sounds like there's a lot of active collaboration, active problem solving, active creative thinking, right, in order to best help these families. So certainly no easy feat. With everything that you just shared about what is on case managers' plates, what is one thing that you wish other professionals understood about working with case managers on these cases?
I wish that other professionals understood that it is challenging to deal with all the different players in the case. There is no possible way to keep everybody happy. You keep the caregiver happy, you upset the parents, vice versa. You keep the guardian happy, you upset the attorneys. So, like I said before, it goes back to being transparent and being consistent. Don't fall into telling each party what it is they want to hear because that will come back to you. So when you get to a place where everyone's together, you want everyone to know that you told the same version of what was happening in that case. But I would want other professionals who deal solely with one participant or a small group of participants in a case to understand is that case management is trying to balance all of those individuals, to give them their time, to respect their perspective on the case, to uphold their trust and supporting all those people. It can be difficult.
Absolutely. And looking ahead, what changes or innovations would you want to see about how our systems support families that are experiencing domestic violence and the child welfare system?
I'm happy to know that now there is a co-located plan in place in all the counties in Florida. So, we've really, it's been a lot of years, but we really have finally gotten there. So that's hopeful and helpful. I would like to see somebody, a professional, also being available that I don't know so much as co-located, but definitely more available that can provide insight into their perspective on addressing the batterers in the case, not just the survivor, because that's the role of the co-located advocate. They're working with the survivor and the children, but really getting somebody in there that can address the alleged perpetrator right out of the gate, because that's really, where the accountability needs to start from. I think that, like I said, I would like to see some more diversified training available for case management, so that they can understand. Because if you look at the design, child welfare opened their doors and said, "Okay, come in. Come with us out on calls. Come stay in our offices with us. See how it is in investigations world." But because of the anonymity of domestic violence survivors services, that door cannot open. So it's very difficult because they can't have them in their office. They can't say, "Hey, come sit in here and listen to us as we work with survivors and we safety plan and we help them get injunctions for protection." I would like to see more utilization of Chapter 39s for our non-related perpetrators of violence, our paramours. I think that that's a unique and underutilized mechanism that can be I've seen it be very successful in keeping children safe, because that has become a barrier where that individual is not related. So therefore, you cannot put in a legal protection for something that you don't have any rights to in the first place. So that's something I would like to see more utilized in the future. But in general, I just continuing, and also maybe another thing would be cross training our other parties, not just focusing on the training going to child welfare frontline workers. Cross training the guardian ad litem, cross training the judiciary, making sure that all the parties involved with these individuals know what it's like to experience domestic violence, know what it's like and how impactful it is on child welfare, and safety. That it's not just, well, leave and go to a shelter. There's so much that can crumble when that happens for a survivor, and then you're being looked at because you don't have the means to take care of your kids. So it's like, well, it's kind of a lose-lose. So it's important for parties like the guardian ad litem to understand that it's not as black and white as leave, don't leave. So I would just really like for there to be a bigger audience when it comes to these deeper, more meaningful trainings.
Absolutely. More robust and a greater reach. And I think that really listening to folks like you said, the door can't swing open both ways because of the confidentiality concerns on the domestic violence side of things. And so to have that fuller understanding outside of lived experience, we're relying on folks who have professional experience in both of those spaces, and you are one of those people, so I really appreciate you being willing to share your perspective from all vantage points with us today. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to cover?
Not that I can think of. I mean, I find this topic to be so valuable, and I'm glad we can continue to address it together. Glad that I can be of assistance in bridging the gap. I think it's very important that we continue to bridge the gap. We continue to be present and supportive of our survivors so they do not feel any more isolated than they've already been made to feel by their perpetrators. So I'm grateful that you asked me to come on and talk about this important topic today.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your experience, the important role that case management plays in supporting families, and all the other perspectives that you brought to the table today. We're very appreciative of your time.
No problem. Thank you so much, Lisa.
If you're interested in learning more about this episode, please visit our website at ficw.fsu.edu. Thanks to Izzy Krang, Brantley Jones, and Dave Heller for their help in putting together this episode. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. I'm Dr. Lisa Magruder for the Florida Institute for Child Welfare.